I remember the exact moment I realized my life had quietly fallen apart. It wasn't dramatic. There was no thunder, no broken mirror, no single catastrophic moment where everything shattered at once. It was a Tuesday in late September, the kind of Tuesday that smells like wet pavement and regret, and I was sitting on the edge of my bed in a studio apartment that was so small I could touch both walls if I stretched my arms wide enough. My name is Ethan Collins. I was 22 years old. I had $47 in my bank account. My phone was 3 months behind on its bill, and I hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. Not because I was being dramatic, not because I was on some kind of cleanse, but because $47 has to stretch in ways that food sometimes loses the argument. I grew up in Millfield, Indiana, a town so small the welcome sign and the goodbye sign are nailed to the same post. My mom worked double shifts at the diner on Route 9 for 20 years. My dad left when I was 6 and sent Christmas cards until I was 10, then stopped. I had a younger sister named Gracie who was 12 going on 40, and a grandmother who smelled like lavender and told me every Sunday that I was going to do something important with my life. I believed her, because grandmothers are supposed to be right about things like that. I moved to Chicago 2 months before that Tuesday, chasing a graphic design internship at a mid-sized marketing firm called Harlow & Reed. The internship paid $12 an hour, 25 hours a week. Do the math and you'll understand the $47. The studio I'd moved into, a third-floor walk-up on the north side, in a neighborhood called Wicker Park, had been a miracle when I found it. A sublet from a woman named Donna, who was going to spend 6 months in Portugal. She charged me $800 a month, which was the cheapest thing I could find that wasn't a shared room with 6 strangers and a mysterious smell. That the miracle ended when Donna emailed me in September to say she was staying in Portugal permanently, had rented the apartment to someone else starting October 1st, and wished me all the best. That's how I found myself on a Tuesday evening, sitting on the edge of a bed that wasn't mine, in a city that didn't know my name. With $47 and no plan, I opened my laptop. The hinges were broken on the right side, and it sat at an angle, like a tired old dog resting its head, and I typed into the search bar, "rooms for rent." Chicago cheap, 312 results. I filtered by price. The ones I could afford were listed with photos that made my current situation look like a luxury hotel. I scrolled for an hour. I started to feel that particular brand of despair that isn't loud or sharp, but is instead quiet and heavy. It's like wearing a coat made of wet wool. And then I found the listing room available immediately. Wicker Park. Shared 2-bedroom. $650 month includes utilities. Looking for a responsible, easygoing roommate. No drama, no mess, no excuses. If you're a decent human being, get in touch. And that was the entire listing. No photos of the room. No paragraph about neighborhood amenities. No mention of parking or laundry or whether the building had a gym. Just something about the directness of it made me laugh. A short, tired laugh, the kind you produce when you've forgotten what it feels like to find things funny. I clicked contact before I could second-guess myself. I wrote, "Hi, my name is Ethan. I'm a graphic design intern at Harlow & Reed. I've been in Chicago for 2 months. I'm clean, I'm quiet, and I promise I'm a decent human being, though I suppose everyone says that. I'm available to look at the room whenever works for you." I sent it and closed the laptop and lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, which had a water stain shaped like a lopsided heart. My phone buzzed 20 minutes later. The number was local. The text said, "Can you come tomorrow at 6? 1847 Indaman Avenue, apartment 3B. No, I typed back, "Yes, thank you." I didn't sleep well that night. I made a mental inventory of everything I owned that could fit into 2 suitcases if the apartment turned out to be terrible, or if this Noah person turned out to be unhinged. 1 suitcase for clothes, 1 for my laptop, my sketchbooks, my copy of The Alchemist that my grandmother gave me when I graduated high school, and a framed photo of my sister Gracie making a face at the camera at a 4th of July barbecue 2 summers ago. That was everything. That was my whole life, compressed into 2 suitcases and $47. I thought, this is either going to be fine or it's going to be a disaster. I didn't know yet that it was going to be neither. I didn't know yet that it was going to be something I didn't have a word for. Something that would take almost a year to understand and about 3 minutes to feel once I finally allowed myself to feel it. But that's the thing about the moments that change your life. They don't announce themselves. They just show up on a Tuesday wearing a hoodie and holding a mug of coffee and ask if you want to come inside. The building was a red brick 3-flat on a tree-lined street, the kind of street that feels like it belongs in a movie about autumn. There were 2 bicycles chained to the porch railing, a potted plant by the front door, a spider plant, slightly overgrown, clearly loved. The buzzer panel had 3 names on it. The 143B said, "Only Carter." I pressed it at 6:01 p.m. Having spent the entire L ride coaching myself to seem normal, be normal, Ethan. Be a normal, functional human person who has his life together. The buzzer crackled. A voice said, coming down. 60 seconds later, the door opened. The first thing I noticed about Noah Carter was that he was tall. Not intimidatingly tall, but the kind of tall where you register it as a quality. The way you'd register that someone has a loud laugh or bright eyes. He was maybe 6'1", with dark brown hair that was slightly too long and fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he kept meaning to get it cut but kept not doing it. He was wearing a gray Henley and dark jeans, and he was holding a mug that said, "Architects do IT by design," in faded blue letters. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you're trying to figure out if they're going to be a problem. I apparently passed some initial test, because he smiled a quick, easy smile, like breathing, and stepped aside to let me in. "Ethan," he said. "Yeah." "Noah." "Yeah, come on up. Watch the 3rd step. It's loose." The apartment was on the 3rd floor, as advertised. The stairwell smelled like old wood and someone's dinner, garlic, and something warm. I followed him up to flights, stepping carefully over the 3rd step. And he pushed open the door to 3B. I walked in and my first thought was, oh, it's a real apartment, I know how that sounds. But after 2 months in Donna's studio, which had roughly the square footage of a parking space and the personality of a dentist's waiting room, walking into 1847 North Damen 3B felt like excelling. It was a proper 2-bedroom, a real living room with actual furniture. A kitchen with a table that had 4 chairs around it even though there were only going to be 2 of us, and windows that caught the last of the evening light and spread it across the hardwood floors in long golden rectangles. There were bookshelves. Filled ones, not decorative ones. There were framed prints on the walls, architectural drawings, mostly beautiful and precise lines that moved like music. There was a record player on a low shelf beside the TV, and it smelled good. It smelled like coffee and wood and something faintly like cedar. "This is the living room," Noah said, gesturing as though I couldn't see that. But it wasn't condescending, it was just practical. "Kitchen through there. My room's the one on the left. The available room's at the end of the hall. It's smaller, but it's got a better view." He led me down the short hallway and opened the door to a room that was maybe 12 by 10 feet. With a window that looked out over the back alley and a maple tree that had just started, turning orange at the edges. It had a closet with sliding doors. It had a ceiling fan. It had old hardwood floors with a small scuff near the window where something had been dragged once, long ago. I wanted it immediately. Not because it was spectacular. It wasn't. Because something about it felt possible. It felt like a room where a person could catch their breath. "Fits a full bed and a desk comfortably," Noah said. "Previous tenant had both. He left the desk if you want it." I looked at the desk in the corner. It was simple and wooden and slightly scarred, but it was solid. "I'd want it," I said. Noah leaned against the doorframe and studied me in that same assessing way he'd looked at me on the front steps. "Tell me about the internship," he said. So I did. I told him about Harlow and Reed, about the commute, about the hours, about the hourly rate. I didn't tell him about the $47 or the eviction, but I also didn't lie. I told him I was from Indiana, that I'd studied design at a state school on partial scholarship, that I was trying to get enough experience to go full-time at the firm or somewhere like it. He listened without interrupting, which I'd later learn was characteristic. Noah Carter was not a man who filled silence just to fill it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm a junior architect at Berenson and Park downtown. I work weird hours sometimes, late nights, early starts. I need the place to be quiet after 10, and I need the kitchen to be clean. I cook most nights, and I'm happy to make enough for two if you tell me dietary stuff. I'm not looking for a best friend, but I'm not looking for a ghost either. I want someone who's actually here." He said it plainly, not unkindly. I said, "That all sounds fine." "More than fine?" He nodded once. "Then, when do you need to move in?" I almost laughed. "Tomorrow, if that's possible." Something shifted in his expression, not pity, exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if he'd heard that kind of urgency before and knew what it meant. "Okay," he said. "First month and deposit. Can you manage that?" I had $1,300 left on my credit card. "Yes," I said. "Then it's yours," Noah said. He held out his hand and I shook it. And that was that. I moved in the next morning with 2 suitcases and a bus route map. I'd printed at the public library. Noah was already gone to work when I arrived. He'd left a key on the kitchen counter with a yellow sticky note that said, "Coffee's in the cabinet above the machine. Help yourself." Nee made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I looked out the window at the maple tree and the morning sky. For the first time in weeks, I felt something loosen in my chest. I didn't know it then, but I was already being saved, quietly, without fanfare. The way all the most important things begin. Living with a stranger is one of the strangest things a person can do. You share walls and cabinets and a bathroom schedule and the ambient sound of each other's lives, but you don't yet share a language. You're reading someone in real time, building a map of them from small details the way an archaeologist builds. A civilization from pottery shards. In the first 2 weeks, I learned the shape of Noah Carter. He woke at 6:15 every morning, even on weekends. He made his coffee in a French press, real coffee. Not the instant kind I'd been drinking for months, and he stood at the kitchen window while it brewed. Sometimes for 5 full minutes, just looking at the street below with the expression of someone organizing their thoughts. He was not a morning talker, which suited me fine. Because I wasn't either. He listened to music while he worked at his drafting table. A large tilted surface that occupied most of his room, visible through his open door when I walked past. He listened to a mix of things: jazz, some indie folk, occasionally classical. Once in a while something so aggressively loud that I was startled until I realized it was coming from his headphones, not the speakers. He seemed to listen to whatever the project required. Quiet music for detail work. Loud music for something that frustrated him. He cooked real dinners. Not elaborate, not showy, but real, actual vegetables that he'd bought from the produce stand 2 blocks over. Actual proteins, things seasoned with more than salt. He'd make enough for 2 and leave a plate on the stove with a lid on it if he ate before I got home. And he'd text me a 1-line message. "There's food." That was it. Not "I made you dinner" or "help yourself." Just, "There's food." I started leaving for work 5 minutes earlier so I could pass his building on the walk to the L and stop to get him a coffee from the place on. Milwaukee that made it in the way he liked. Dark. No sugar, splash of oat milk, and I'd leave it on the kitchen counter before he woke up. I don't know exactly when I started doing that. It felt like something that made sense. He noticed. He didn't mention it for 3 days, and then one morning I came out of my room and he was already up, standing at the kitchen counter with the coffee in his hand, and he looked at me over the rim of the cup and said, "You don't have to do this," said. "I know." He looked at me a moment longer, then nodded, and that was the entire conversation. But after that, he started leaving a croissant on the counter next to the coffee maker on Tuesday mornings, which was my hardest day at the firm, the one with the 7 a.m. design review. Just a croissant, from the bakery around the corner, in a small paper bag. No note. I don't know why small acts of kindness hit harder than large ones. Maybe because they require attention. You have to actually notice someone to be kind to them in small ways. Large gestures are sometimes more about the giver than the receiver. Small ones are always about the receiver. I noticed him noticing me, and something about that being noticed felt like water after a very long walk. The first time we really actually talked, was 3 weeks after I moved in. It was a Friday night, and I'd had a bad day at the firm. A presentation I'd worked on for 2 weeks had been met with polite indifference by the senior creative director, a woman named Margot who had the particular talent of making you feel both critiqued and invisible simultaneously. I came home at 7, dropped my bag by the door, and sat on the living room couch without taking my shoes off, which I never did. Noah came out of his room and took one look at me and said, "What happened?" I told him. Not in the abbreviated way you describe a bad day to a near stranger, but in the full, unedited way, the presentation, Margot's response, the feeling of standing in that glass-walled conference room watching 12 months of genuine creative effort be reduced to interesting but not quite what we're looking for. I told him about the $12 an hour rate and the math that didn't add up and the credit card that was getting closer to its limit every month. I didn't mean to say all of it. It just came out. There's something about the way he listened completely, without looking at his phone or interrupting or offering hollow reassurances that made it impossible to stop. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come with me." He went to the kitchen, and I followed him, and he opened the fridge and started pulling things out, leftover rice, eggs, some vegetables, a jar of gochujang. He heated the pan and started cooking without another word. And the kitchen filled with a good, sharp smell. And I sat on the counter, something he usually wouldn't allow, because that's where food goes. Collins, and he didn't say anything about that either. He made fried rice. Good fried rice, the kind with a crispy bottom and a soft, fragrant middle. With a fried egg on top with the yolk still runny, he put the bowl in front of me and then sat across the table with his own bowl. And we ate. And then he said, "Your instinct is right. Though I looked up the work you showed me last week, the poster concepts, they're genuinely good. Not in turn good, actually good. Margot's wrong, or she has different needs than your skill set. Both of those things can be true simultaneously." I'd showed him some of my work the week before. Almost accidentally, I'd left my sketchbook on the table, and he'd asked if he could look, and I'd said yes. And he'd leafed through it slowly without speaking, and then handed it back and said solid in that plain, unelaborated way of his, which I'd interpreted as polite and forgotten. Apparently he'd meant it. "You're going to outgrow that internship," he said. "That's not a bad thing. But in the meantime, stop letting Margot be your mirror. She's not the right one." I looked at him across the table. I asked. He shrugged, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked almost self-conscious. "Same thing happened to me in my second year at the firm. Had a senior partner who reviewed my drawings the way Margot reviewed your work. I spent 4 months thinking I'd chosen the wrong career." He took a bite of rice. I hadn't. "What changed?" I asked. "Got a different mirror," he said. We ate the rest of the fried rice in comfortable silence, and then he cleaned the kitchen, and I dried the dishes. And then we sat on the couch and watched something on television, a documentary about migratory birds, I think, which was either profoundly random or exactly right, and I fell asleep halfway through it, didn't wake up until the early hours of the morning, when I found a blanket had been laid over me and the TV had been turned off. I went to bed properly after that. And I lay in the dark and thought about mirrors, and about what it meant that a person could see you more clearly than you saw yourself. I should talk about the other thing. The thing that was underneath everything else. I'd known I was gay since I was 15. Sitting in the bleachers at a high school football game and realizing that I was watching the quarterback the same way the girls around me were watching the quarterback, it arrived with a particular mixture of clarity and terror that I suspect most gay people in small towns recognize. A sudden understanding of something that had always been true, paired immediately with the understanding of how complicated that truth was going to be. Millfield, Indiana, was not hostile exactly. It was just small. Small in that way that makes silence louder than any words. My mother was the kind of woman who worked too hard to have energy for anything but survival. I loved her too much to add to her weight. My grandmother would have loved me unconditionally. I knew that, but she died the summer I turned 18. 3 months before I left for college, and I never got to tell her. I came out to exactly 2 people before Chicago. My roommate freshman year of college, a good-natured kid from Wisconsin named Derek, who said cool man, and then asked if I wanted to order pizza, which was the correct response. And my best friend since 6th grade, a girl named Melissa who cried a little and then made me watch every season of Queer Eye with her over winter break, which was also the correct response. That was it. 2 people in 22 years I dated or tried to. There had been a guy in my junior year named Ryan who kissed me once at a party and then spent the next semester avoiding eye contact in the design studio. There had been some brief, mostly digital situationships that never quite translated into real life. Nothing that lasted more than a few weeks.